On a bright Tuesday morning in July 1883, on the banks of the River Clyde in Glasgow, nearly 200 men and boys climbed aboard a brand new ship for what should have been the proudest moment of their working year. Within 2 minutes, more than half of them were dead. There was no war, there was no storm, no act of God, and no act of terrorism. There was only a ship that had never been tested for the one thing that mattered most, launched in front of a cheering crowd into a river that swallowed her almost before the applause had finished. 124 people did not go home that evening. Most of Britain has never heard their names. To understand how a routine Tuesday at one of the most respected shipyards on earth became one of the worst disasters in the history of British shipbuilding, you have to go back to what made that yard and that river and that morning feel so completely safe. Before we go on, this channel is just getting started, so if these forgotten corners of Victorian Britain are the kind of history you come back for, take a moment to subscribe so the next one finds you, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. To understand what happened at Lint House, you first have to understand what Govan was. By 1883, this stretch of the Clyde, a few miles downstream from the centre of Glasgow, had become one of the greatest concentrations of shipbuilding skill anywhere on the planet. The phrase Clyde built was already a mark of quality that ship owners in London, Liverpool and beyond understood without explanation. It meant a hull that would outlast its mortgage. It meant an engine that would not fail in the Bay of Biscay. Govan itself had grown up almost entirely around the yards. Streets of tenement housing ran down nearly to the water's edge, and inside them lived generation after generation of riveters, platers, joiners, plumbers, and labourers, along with the boys who were apprenticed to all of those trades from as young as 13 or 14. It was common, almost expected, for a father to walk his son through the gates of the yard where he himself had learned his trade 20 years before. Neighbours worked alongside neighbours, brothers worked alongside brothers. Among the firms that built this reputation, Alexander Stephen and Sons stood near the very top. The company had moved its operations to purpose-built premises at Lint House in 1870, a modern yard by the standards of the day, laid out to produce steamers, clippers, and increasingly ambitious merchant tonnage for owners across the world. The firm was led by Alexander Stephen, the senior partner, a man whose family name had been attached to shipbuilding on the Clyde for decades. His brother in business, John Stephen, took an active hand in the yard's day-to-day operations, while a third partner, an engineer named Kemp, oversaw the technical side of construction. Between them, the Stephens had built a business built on trust. Trust from ship owners that a Stephen-built hull would perform, and trust from their own workforce that the yard, however dangerous shipbuilding inherently was, followed the accepted practices of the trade to the letter. And one of those accepted practices in 1883 was this. When a new ship was ready to be launched down the slipway and into the river, it was entirely ordinary. Indeed, it was the standard practice on the Clyde and at every major shipbuilding river in Britain for the yard's own workforce to remain aboard as she entered the water. Not as passengers, as workers. The moment an unfinished hull was afloat, fitting out could begin. The joiners, plumbers and riggers, boarding not out of ceremony, but because their labour was needed the instant she touched water, so that no time was wasted before the next contract demanded the same slipway. Hundreds of men, sometimes very young men, would stand on the deck of a ship that had no boilers fitted, no completed interior, and often no ballast beyond whatever loose fittings and tools happened to be aboard, as she slid down greased ways into the current. No ship on the Clyde had ever capsized doing this, not once, and it was precisely that unbroken record which meant nobody, in any yard on the river, had ever stopped to ask what would happen if one did. The vessel due to take that same journey on the 3rd of July 1883 was named the Daphne. She was a 500-ton iron steamer, some 175 feet in length, 25 feet in the beam, built to order for Messrs. A. A. Laird and Company for their steam packet service, linking Glasgow with Londonderry, a route that carried passengers, mail and cargo across the Irish Sea on a tight and profitable schedule. At the point of her launch, the Daphne was still very much a work in progress. Her engines had been fitted, but she carried no boilers, the great iron drums that in a finished vessel would sit low in the hull and provide, almost as a byproduct of their sheer weight, a stabilising mass low in the ship's centre. Without them, the Daphne was, in the most literal sense, top-heavy for her size and lighter in the water than her finished silhouette suggested. Where her boilers would eventually sit, there was instead an open hatchway, a hole in her deck leading straight down into the hull. Part of her starboard deck plating, too, had not yet been laid. These were not oversights. They were simply the ordinary, unremarkable condition of a hull at this stage of construction, exactly as dozens of other vessels had been launched from this yard, and others like it, year after year, without incident. What made the Daphne different was never something anyone could see by looking at her. It was something nobody, anywhere on the Clyde, had ever calculated. For decades, shipbuilders on the river had judged whether a hull was safe to launch, not through arithmetic, but through memory. A yard's foreman and partners looked at a new vessel, compared her by eye to others of similar size and shape that had gone down the same ways without trouble, and pronounced her fit to launch. This was not recklessness in the way a modern observer might assume. It was simply how the trade had always worked, an inherited confidence built on an extraordinary safety record. Nobody calculated the metacentric height of a hull at launching draft. Nobody weighed the loose gear scattered across her decks, the tool chests, the coils of chain, the stacks of unfitted iron plate, against the water she would displace the moment she began to roll. Nobody counted the workmen standing on her deck as a variable in a stability equation, because nobody had ever needed to. The Daphne would carry an estimated 30 tons of loose equipment and fittings that morning, none of it lashed down, none of it accounted for in any formal sense, because no formal sense existed to account for it in. Layered on top of that was the human weight itself. Somewhere in the region of 195 men and boys, tradesmen due to begin fitting out work, apprentices sent along to assist them, would stand on her decks as she entered the water. Unlike ballast, which sits low and still, men stand upright and men move. If a ship begins to lean, even slightly, human instinct does what iron and stone never do. It shifts toward the high side, or away from the low one, in a way that no calculation of the day accounted for, and that, in the Daphne's case, would only ever compound whatever list she had already begun to develop. It was a hazard built entirely from ordinary things, done in the ordinary way, by men who had every reason, from 13 years of an unbroken record on this exact stretch of river, to believe they were following a safe and proven method. There was a third element, mechanical rather than human, and this was the piece even the most careful eye on the bank that morning could not have judged. Every launch on the Clyde used checking gear, anchors and chains laid out to drag against the riverbed and slow a ship's momentum once she was afloat, so that she did not simply career across the river and strike the far bank. For the checking gear to do its job evenly, it had to grip evenly on both sides. Nobody could know, until the moment the Daphne was actually moving, whether the ground beneath the river, on her port side and her starboard side, would hold her anchors with anything like the same force. None of this, on its own, was a warning that had been raised and dismissed. There is no record, in the aftermath of what followed, of a foreman objecting, of a letter written and ignored, of a partner overruled. That is, in some ways, the harder truth to sit with. The flaw in the Daphne was not a corner deliberately cut. It was an entire industry's method for judging a ship's safety, built on precedent rather than proof, applied without a single change to a hull that, as it happened, needed something no yard on the river yet knew how to give her. The morning of the 3rd of July, 1883, began exactly like dozens of mornings before it at Lint House. There was nothing in the Glasgow papers, nothing in the routine of the yard, to mark this Tuesday out as different from any other working day. A launch was not a holiday. It was business, scheduled and expected, and the crowd that gathered along the Govan riverbank that morning came for the same reason crowds always gathered for a Clyde launch: to watch a new ship take her first contact with the water that would carry her for the rest of her working life. John Stephen, the partner who had overseen much of the Daphne's construction, was there that morning to supervise the launch himself, as was customary when a Stephen-built vessel took to the water. Among the tradesmen assembling at the yard gates was a foreman joiner named Alexander Cremond, a man trusted with his own working party of some 20 men, mostly joiners and their apprentices, who were to board the Daphne the moment she was afloat and begin fitting out her interior. Cremond gathered his party as he always did, checked that his men were present, and led them up onto the deck of the ship that had been his responsibility for weeks. Among the joiners due to board that morning was a man named James Malene, who would later tell those close to him that he had felt a distinct unease about going aboard that day, a presentiment, as he described it, that something was wrong. It was not enough to keep him on the bank. Whatever he felt, there was no visible reason for it. The Daphne looked in every outward respect exactly like every other hull that had gone down these ways before her. Riveters, platers, and riggers filed aboard alongside the joiners. A rigger named Alan Malene took up his position. A riveter named Henry O'Farrell found his place on deck. A joiner named William Gourlay, another named T. Bryson, climbed up with the rest. None of them had any reason to hesitate. This was, for every one of them, simply the next stage of a job they had done many times before, on many ships before, on this same stretch of river. By 10:30 that morning, the banks of the Clyde on both sides of Lint House were crowded. Families had come down from the tenements. Off-duty workers from neighbouring yards had walked over to watch. A launch was public theatre as much as it was engineering, and the naming ceremony that preceded it drew spectators the way any celebration would. Somewhere close to 200 men and boys stood on the Daphne's deck as the final preparations were made. The restraining blocks known as dogshores set beneath her hull, holding her in place on the greased slipway until the moment came to release her. At 11:25, the naming ceremony was completed and the order was given. The dogshores were knocked away. For a moment, nothing seemed unusual. The Daphne began to move, gathering pace down the slipway, exactly as a launch was meant to. The crowd on the bank cheering as her bow met open water, and the yard's newest vessel took her first weight upon the river that would, if all went as it always had, carry her out toward a working life on the Irish Sea. She had barely settled into the water when she began to lean. It was slight at first, the kind of list a launched hull might show for a second or two before righting herself, the sort of movement nobody watching from the bank would have thought twice about, because they had seen it 100 times before, and always seen the ship come back level. This time, she did not come back level. The lean continued, and then it began to accelerate, the Daphne rolling further and further onto her port side with every passing second, as the checking gear that was meant to arrest her way failed to hold her straight. On her starboard side, the anchor meant to check her had barely moved, no more than 6 or 7 yards along the riverbed. On her port side, the anchor had dragged more than 60. Caught unevenly, pulled harder on one side than the other, the current took hold of her and swung her further onto her side than any launch on this river had ever gone. Water began pouring in through the open hatchway where her boilers should have stood. It poured too through the section of starboard deck that had never been plated over. 30 tons of unsecured gear, tool chests, coiled chain, loose iron fittings began to shift with the tilt of the deck, sliding toward the low side and adding their weight to a hull that was already going over. And on that deck, close to 200 men who had walked aboard only minutes before were suddenly standing on a surface tilting fast beneath their feet, with nowhere prepared, nowhere designated for what was happening. It took, by the accounts of those who lived through it, no more than a minute or two from the moment the dogshores fell to the moment the Daphne rolled fully onto her port side and went under. Some witnesses on the bank would later say it felt faster still, a matter of seconds between the cheer and the silence. She went down deck first, the water closing over men who, moments before, had been climbing aboard for an ordinary day's work. On the bank, the cheering stopped within seconds of starting. What the crowd had come to watch as a celebration had become, in the space of perhaps 90 seconds, a catastrophe playing out in full view of hundreds of onlookers, close enough to see faces, close enough for some to recognize their own husbands, sons and brothers in the water. The response was immediate. Nearby boats and tugs on the river turned toward the wreck within minutes, and men who could swim, from the yard, from neighbouring vessels, from the crowd itself, went into the Clyde without waiting for instruction. Alexander Craymond, the foreman who had led his party of 20 men aboard less than an hour before, managed to catch hold of a davit as the ship went over and clung to it until a tug reached him. Of the 20 men who had followed him onto the Daphne that morning, 17 did not survive. Craymond would carry that number for the rest of his life. Others found their own way clear. Alan Moline, the rigger, swam unaided through the wreckage and open water to reach safety. Henry O'Farrell, the riveter, tried in the last moments, before the ship went under, to use her wheel to fight the list, before he too was pulled from the water by a tug. William Gourlay, the joiner, was knocked from his feet as the deck tilted beneath him, scrambled onto the exposed hull as she rolled, and was taken off by boat before she went down completely. James Moline, the man who had felt his unease that morning and boarded anyway, was pulled clear on a rope thrown from a tug. T. Bryson, a strong swimmer among the joiners, struck out for the shore and reached it from near the stern of the sinking ship. A painter named John Russell also survived, and it was Russell who later gave one of the clearest accounts of what those final moments aboard the Daphne had actually felt like, an ordinary working morning tipping, in the space of a breath, into chaos. The cause of death, in the great majority of cases, was drowning. It is a plain fact, and it is the only description this story needs of what happened to the men and boys who did not come up again. By 1:30 that afternoon, recovery work was already underway. The dead were brought ashore to a temporary mortuary set up in the yard's own spar shed, a working building turned within hours into a place for grieving families to identify their own. By that evening, 41 bodies had been recovered, and 39 of them had already been named by relatives and neighbours who came to Lint House in growing numbers as the news spread through Govan streets. Among those confirmed dead that first night were men whose names appeared in the Glasgow papers. Within days, Michael Flood, John Murray, John Ladden, Maurice Dunn, William Mason, and dozens more beside them, each one a son, a husband, a father, an apprentice, named individually, so that Govan would know precisely who it had lost rather than simply how many. Recovery did not end that evening. The Daphne herself lay capsized in the river, her port side pinned into the riverbed mud, under the combined weight of her own hull and the debris that had shifted with her, and for the families of those still unaccounted for. There was nothing to do but wait while engineers worked out how to raise her. Divers went down into the wreck itself in the days that followed. A Clyde Trust diver named Thomas Fisher, along with divers Stephen Wallace and James Limburn from the yard of J&G Thompson, carried out much of that underwater work, moving through flooded, debris-choked compartments in search of the men still trapped inside. Fisher's account of those conditions, working blind in the dark, silted water of a capsized hull, remains one of the few first-hand descriptions of what recovery actually demanded of the men who carried it out. It took more than a fortnight, and the eventual raising of the entire vessel using pontoons before the last of the bodies could finally be brought up and named. By the time the recovery was complete, 124 people were confirmed dead. Roughly 70 had survived. The disaster was reported within days as far away as London. The Illustrated London News gave it the front page of its edition of the 14th of July, and the London Evening Standard called it a disaster unparalleled in the history of shipbuilding, a judgment that, for a trade that had never before lost a ship on launch day, was not an exaggeration. A judgment, an exaggeration, was precisely what the Board of Trade now had to establish. On the 10th of July 1883, 1 week after the Daphne went down, an official investigation opened at the Justiciary Buildings in Glasgow. To chair it, the Crown appointed a man whose expertise made him almost uniquely qualified for the task. Sir Edward J. Reed, a Member of Parliament and formerly Chief Constructor of the Royal Navy, a man who had spent his career on precisely the kind of stability calculations that no Clyde shipbuilder had thought to apply to a launch. Reed's inquiry heard from survivors, from yard officials, from engineers, over a period of weeks, building a picture of exactly what had gone wrong beneath the surface of that ordinary Tuesday morning. He examined the open boiler hatchway. He examined the missing section of starboard deck. He weighed the 30 tons of loose gear against what a finished hull, ballasted and boilered, would have carried at the same draft. He considered the uneven drag of the two checking anchors, one moving only 6 or 7 yards, the other dragging 60, and concluded that while the mismatch in the anchors had worsened the roll once it began, it was not the underlying cause of the disaster. The underlying cause, Reed found, was simpler and far more damning. The Daphne had been launched with inadequate stability for her condition, and nobody, at any stage of her construction, had performed the calculations that would have revealed that fact before she ever touched water. When Reed's report was published that August and laid before Parliament, it did something few official inquiries of the period did. It did not simply describe what had happened. It named plainly what the entire trade had been doing wrong for decades. Ship launches on the Clyde, and across British shipbuilding more broadly, had been judged safe by comparison and by memory rather than by mathematics. No Clyde-built ship had ever capsized on launch before the Daphne, and that unbroken record had itself become the reason nobody had ever felt the need to calculate what might happen if one did. And yet, when it came to the question every grieving family in Govan wanted answered, who was responsible, the inquiry's conclusion landed very differently. Alexander Stephen and Sons, the firm that had built the Daphne, launched her and lost 124 of the men and boys in its own employ, and its own community was cleared of criminal liability. The firm was, in fact, commended for its cooperation with the inquiry and for how it had conducted itself in the aftermath, arranging support for bereaved families and covering, from its own funds, the cost of raising and repairing the vessel, since the company had taken out fire insurance on its ships, but no policy that covered a loss of this kind. Stephen and Sons paid for the disaster financially, even as the law absolved them of it. For many in Govan, that verdict did not read as justice. It read as an industry investigating itself and finding, in the end, that nobody among the men who ran it had done anything wrong, despite 124 of their neighbours lying dead. There is no surviving document that proves a cover-up in the literal sense, no suppressed report, no buried warning that was quietly set aside. What exists instead is something almost as telling: a community that watched its dead be named, watched the owners of the yard walk away without charge, and drew its own conclusions about where the line between accident and negligence had actually been drawn that summer. Alexander Stephen himself left no entry at all in his personal diary for the 3rd of July 1883. The page beside that date left entirely blank, a silence that later researchers combing through the firm's own archive would find more eloquent than any statement he could have made. What Reed's inquiry did achieve, in the end, was not a prosecution, but a permanent change to how ships were sent down every slipway in Britain from that point forward. His report recommended, in direct and specific terms, that no vessel should be launched without a proper calculation of her stability at launching draft, one that accounted for her unballasted, unfinished condition, for any loose equipment and fittings still aboard, and critically, for the weight of the workmen standing on her decks. Where before a launch had been judged safe by comparison to the ships that had gone before her, it would now be judged safe by arithmetic, by a naval architect's sums, checked and confirmed before the dogshores were ever knocked away. Alongside that came a second, equally direct change. Yards were to stop sending their full fitting-out crews aboard a ship at the moment of launch. Only those workers actually needed to handle mooring lines and bring the vessel under control once she was afloat would remain aboard as she entered the water. The practice that had put nearly 200 men and boys on the Daphne's deck that July morning, a practice so ordinary that nobody had ever thought to question it, was brought to an end specifically because of what had happened to them. These were not vague recommendations left to gather dust. Within a remarkably short span, calculated launch stability and limited launch day crews became standard practice across the Clyde, and from there across British shipbuilding as a whole. It fed directly into the wider professionalisation of naval architecture that would define the closing decades of the 19th century, a shift from craft judgment toward engineering discipline that the Daphne, in the worst possible way, had helped to force into being. Every ship launched anywhere in the world today, whether from a Clyde yard or a container port on the far side of the globe, goes down her slipway only after a calculated stability assessment has confirmed she is safe to do so, and only with a crew aboard limited to those the operation actually requires. That standard exists in a direct, traceable line from a single morning at Lint House, even though the great majority of people who benefit from it have never heard the Daphne's name. The ship herself did not stay at the bottom of the Clyde, and she did not stay wrecked. Raised, repaired and returned to service that same year, she sailed again from September 1883 under a new name, the Rose. She was renamed again the following year, becoming the Ianthe, and again in 1890, becoming the Eleni. Under that final name, she continued working for nearly 3 more decades, until she was lost off Tenedos in Greece on the 10th of December 1918, sunk not by any flaw in her stability, but by a mine in the closing weeks of a war that had nothing to do with the disaster that had once nearly ended her before she had properly begun. In Glasgow, the dead of the 3rd of July were not scattered anonymously. Around 50 of the victims were buried together at Creighton Cemetery, where a monument designed by William Robin was erected in 1885, 2 years after the disaster, standing as the principal physical memorial to what happened at Lint House. It remains there today, a marker in a city that has otherwise, in large part, moved on from the event it commemorates. The Lint House yard itself no longer builds ships. Alexander Stephen and Sons, once among the most trusted names on the river, ceased operating long ago, and the site where the Daphne once stood ready for launch has been given over to other uses entirely. Among those named at Creighton and in the newspaper columns that listed the dead in the days after the disaster were boys who had barely begun their working lives. Apprentices as young as 14 were counted among the 124. Boys who had been sent aboard that morning, not as spectators, but as part of the ordinary machinery of the yard. Snipper boys, rivet boys, apprentice plumbers, and joiners learning trades that, for some of them, they had held for only a matter of months. Their families buried them alongside grown men who had spent decades on the river, a detail that Govan did not forget quickly, even as the wider country's attention moved on within weeks to whatever news followed. The University of Glasgow holds much of what survives of Alexander Stephen and Sons in its business, archive, ledgers, correspondence, and the personal diary with its blank page for the 3rd of July, material that has allowed local historians in Govan and across Glasgow to keep returning to the Daphne long after the national newspapers stopped. Anniversary pieces have appeared in the Scottish press periodically in the decades since, small acts of remembering in a city whose shipbuilding history is dense with achievement and, inevitably, with loss. It is not a story that tourists come looking for. There is no visitor centre, no marked trail along the Clyde retracing what happened that morning. What remains is the monument at Creighton, the archive at the university, and the quiet, persistent interest of people in Govan who know that a disaster of this scale happened on their own streets and are unwilling to let it disappear entirely from memory. For the men who survived that morning, the Daphne did not end when they were pulled from the river. Alexander Craymond returned in time to work on the Clyde, but those who knew him in later years said he carried the loss of his working party quietly for the rest of his life, an unspoken reckoning between a foreman and the 17 men who had been under his charge and had not come home with him. It was not the kind of grief that made the newspapers. It lived instead in yards and public houses and Sunday services across Govan, in the private knowledge that nearly every family in the parish either lost someone that day or knew a household that had. Within the trade itself, the lesson of the 3rd of July 1883 passed from foreman to apprentice in a way that outlasted any formal regulation. New generations of Clyde shipwrights, boys who had not been born when the Daphne went down, were taught the new practice of counting hands before a launch and calculating a hull's stability before she ever touched the ways, not as abstract rules handed down from Parliament, but as the plain, unquestioned reason certain things were now done differently on this river. Where the old confidence had rested on an unbroken record, the new discipline rested on arithmetic, and it held launch after launch, in a way the old method eventually could not have. The reach of Reed's findings went further than the Clyde alone. Other British shipbuilding rivers, the Tyne, the Wear, the Mersey, the yards of Belfast where Harland and Wolfe and other builders launched vessels on a scale to rival Glasgow's own, took note of what had happened at Lint House and adjusted their own launch practices accordingly, even where no formal instruction compelled them to. Word of a disaster on this scale, at a firm as respected as Stephen and Sons, travelled through the shipbuilding trade with a speed and weight that official regulation alone could never have matched. Within the institution of naval architects, the body that represented the profession, Reed himself had helped to define through his long career at the Admiralty. The Daphne became a case study returned to for years afterward, cited whenever the question of launching stability was raised. A cautionary example, precise enough in its causes, that it could be taught rather than merely mourned. Reed himself went on, after the Daphne inquiry, to continue a public career that touched shipbuilding policy in Britain for years to come. But it was this report, produced in the weeks after a single Glasgow morning, that stood as one of the most consequential findings of his working life, precisely because it changed a practice that had gone unquestioned since shipbuilding on the Clyde began. John Russell, the painter who survived the capsize, gave one of the few first-hand descriptions of those final seconds that has survived in print. He described the deck tilting beneath him so quickly that men lost their footing before they understood what was happening. The ordinary sounds of a launch, the cheering, the creak of timber, the splash of water along the hull, replaced almost instantly by shouting and the scramble of men trying to reach the high side of a ship that no longer had a high side worth reaching. It was, in Russell's telling, not a slow event that gave anyone time to reason their way to safety. It was over before most of those aboard had time to be afraid. For the Glasgow and Londonderry Steam Packet Company, the firm that had ordered the Daphne to serve its Irish sea route, the disaster meant months without the vessel they had commissioned, a working ship reduced to a wreck on the riverbed, while salvage crews worked to raise her. When she finally returned to service that September, renamed and repaired, she carried with her a history that no repaint could remove, though within the ordinary commercial life of a working steamer, that history would, in time, become simply one more fact about an older ship among many on the same routes, known to her crews, if not to her passengers. In Govan itself, the households that had lost a father, a son, or a brother, that July morning did not have the comfort of a public reckoning that matched the scale of what they had lost. What they had instead was each other, a parish where nearly every family understood exactly what every other family was carrying, and a shared, unspoken agreement that whatever the inquiry had or had not found, the responsibility for that morning did not begin and end with the men who happened to be standing on the Daphne's deck. The Daphne inquiry belonged to a wider pattern taking shape across Victorian Britain in these decades, as one industry after another was forced, usually by disaster rather than foresight, to accept that the state had a legitimate role in setting the terms of safety that private enterprise had never imposed upon itself. Mines, railways, factories, all had already produced their own catalogues of loss that led, however slowly, toward inspection and regulation. Shipbuilding had, until the 3rd of July 1883, remained one of the few major industrial trades on the Clyde still governed almost entirely by its own internal customs, its safety resting on the judgment of the men who ran it rather than on any external standard. The Daphne closed that gap for launching practice specifically, adding shipbuilding to the list of trades where a Victorian government had concluded that experience alone was not a sufficient guarantee against catastrophe. For the Board of Trade itself, the case became part of a growing body of evidence used in the years that followed to justify a wider mandate over maritime safety generally, reaching beyond launches into questions of load lines, construction standards, and seaworthiness that would occupy the department for decades after Reed's report was filed. What began as an investigation into a single capsized hull on a single Glasgow morning became, in that sense, a small but genuine contribution to the machinery of state oversight that shipping in Britain would rely on for the rest of the 19th century and long into the 20th. The disaster also reshaped in a quieter way how Govan itself understood its own trade. Shipbuilding had always been a source of pride in the parish, the skill of Clyde-built vessels, a point of identity for men who spent their working lives among iron plates and rivets. After the 3rd of July, that pride did not disappear, but it sat alongside something it had not carried before, an understanding that the river, which had built Govan's reputation, could also, without warning, take from it in a single morning. Launches continued. The yards kept building, but the crowds that gathered on the bank for the next launch at Lint House, and at every yard along the Clyde in the months that followed, watched with a different kind of attention than they had before, aware in a way they had not quite been previously, that the moment a hull first met, the water was not simply theatre, but a test that could, if nothing had changed, go wrong again. What had changed by the time those crowds gathered again was precisely the thing that mattered. The calculations Reed had called for were by then becoming part of how a launch was prepared, not an afterthought but a formal step no yard could skip, checked and signed off before a single dogshore was touched. The workmen who now stood on a newly launched hull did so in far smaller numbers, and only those whose task required their presence at that exact moment, a limit written directly into yard practice because of what had happened to the men who had stood there before them with no such limit at all. Among the boys whose names appeared on those lists were a 14-year-old snipper boy named George McGee and an apprentice plumber, also 14, named James Douglas Stephen. There was John Leyden, a rivet boy of the same age. A little older, at 15, were Daniel Dillon and an apprentice plumber named Alexander McGregor. These were not labourers with decades of experience behind them. They were boys only a few years into trades they had expected to practice for the rest of their working lives, sent aboard that morning as part of the ordinary rhythm of the yard, exactly as their fathers and older brothers had been. Their graves, where they can still be traced, sit among the wider group buried at Craigton, boys and men together, the distinction between apprentice and tradesman erased by what had happened to all of them on the same morning in the same stretch of river. Not far from where the Daphne herself went down, shipbuilding on the Clyde continues to this day. on yards along the same stretch of river where Alexander Stephen and Sons once stood, now operated by different owners for different purposes, building for the Royal Navy rather than for Irish Sea packet lines. Every vessel that leaves those slipways still does so under the same basic principle Reed's inquiry established: a calculated, engineered confirmation of stability before she ever touches water, and a crew aboard limited strictly to those the launch requires. The men and women who work there today, walking the same ground where Alexander Cramond once gathered his working party of 20, inherit a set of rules that exist because of what was lost on a single morning in 1883, whether or not they have ever heard the ship's name. Elsewhere in the city, smaller and less formal echoes of that July morning persisted in the way Glasgow's shipbuilding communities remembered their own losses generally, in local societies, in family stories passed between generations of Govan households who could trace a great-grandfather or great-uncle back to a name on the Creighton stone. It was never a story that required a plaque on every corner to remain real to the people it belonged to. It lived instead in exactly the way most working-class Victorian tragedies lived on, in kept memory rather than public monument, carried by descendants long after the newspapers that had once filled their front pages with the disaster had moved on to other news. That kept memory is also why so much can still be known today about the men and boys who were aboard that morning, why names like Cramond, Russell, O'Farrell and Gourlay survive at all in written record, rather than being reduced to a single, anonymous total. Local historians in Glasgow, working from surviving newspaper columns, from the university's business archive, from parish and cemetery records, have spent years piecing together exactly who stood on the Daphne's deck that Tuesday, work that has meant the difference between a disaster remembered only as a number and one remembered, however imperfectly, as a list of actual people who had mothers, wives and children waiting for them in the tenements above the yard. The list published in the Glasgow papers that first week ran far beyond the handful of names already spoken here. It included Matthew Young, Andrew Henderson, James Smith, Hugh Mindo, Patrick Beattie, Daniel Mackay, Michael Harkins, Robert Llewellyn, John Kerr, Dugald Morrison, Archibald Greenlees, Matthew Campbell, James Forbes, David Crawford, Thomas Fenton, John Kearney, Duncan McGregor, Arthur Graham, John Rayburn and William Jackson Wiper, among many others whose families read their own surnames in a newspaper column and understood, in that instant, exactly what had happened to them. Behind each name on that list stood a household in Govan that would spend the rest of that summer, and in many cases the rest of their lives, defined by the absence of a man or a boy who had walked out the door that Tuesday morning expecting to be home for his tea. At the time of the disaster, there was no state provision to support the families such losses left behind. The Workmen's Compensation Act, that would eventually require employers to pay for injuries and deaths sustained in the course of employment, still lay more than a decade in the future, and in 1883, a widow whose husband had died in an industrial accident had no legal claim on his employer beyond whatever that employer chose, voluntarily, to provide. What support Govan's bereaved families received in the aftermath of the 3rd of July came largely from charitable subscription, from collections raised within the shipbuilding trade itself, and from whatever Stephen and Sons chose to offer beyond its legal obligation, rather than from any right the law yet recognised. That gap, too, would narrow in the years that followed, part of the same broader shift in Victorian Britain that had begun to treat industrial safety and industrial loss as matters the state could no longer leave entirely to private conscience. In Glasgow itself, a public subscription fund was opened within days of the disaster, drawing contributions from across the city and beyond, from other shipbuilding firms on the river who understood, perhaps better than anyone, how easily the same catastrophe could have struck their own yard instead. Merchants, churches, and ordinary citizens who had never set foot in Lint House gave what they could toward the widows and orphans the disaster had created, a civic response that, whatever its limits, reflected how deeply the loss had registered across a city that measured much of its own identity by what its shipyards built and by the men who built it. In Glasgow, a city that had already begun training a new generation of naval architects in its university lecture halls, the Daphne became one of the formative cases taught to students learning the emerging science of ship stability, a discipline that was, in the 1880s, still young enough that its own history could be measured in individual disasters rather than decades of accumulated theory. Students who would go on to design vessels for yards across Britain and beyond studied what had gone wrong at Lint House, not as a historical curiosity, but as a working example of exactly the calculation their profession now existed to perform, a discipline built, in no small part, out of the specific failure that had killed 124 people on a single Glasgow morning. That teaching, in turn, shaped how the trade itself changed its own internal culture, not simply through Reed's formal recommendations, but through the quieter, longer process of a profession learning to distrust the very confidence that had once been its greatest strength. Where a Clyde foreman in the 1870s might have judged a hull ready by instinct and comparison, his counterpart training in the 1890s was taught to distrust that instinct on principle, to treat every launch as a fresh calculation, regardless of how many similar ships had gone safely down the same ways before. It was a change in temperament as much as in method, a shift from a trade that trusted its own unbroken record toward one that understood, because of what had happened at Lint House, that an unbroken record was never itself proof of safety, only the absence so far of the specific combination of circumstances that would break it. There is no monument that can hold all of what was lost on that stretch of the Clyde. There is only a name, spoken plainly, and a fact that has never stopped being true. On a bright Tuesday morning in July 1883, nearly 200 men and boys went to work as they always had, and 124 of them never went home. Not because of war, not because of storm, not because of anything beyond the reach of ordinary care, but because no one had ever thought to ask a simple question before the water closed over her deck. It is a question every shipyard in the world has answered ever since. It came too late for the men and boys of the Daphne. It has come in time for every ship and every crew that has sailed since.